Picture this. It is a late Friday afternoon in early April 2026. Somewhere in a cafe in Istanbul, the television is tuned to Al Jazeera. Smoke rises from the outskirts of Tehran. Bridges struck, research institutes leveled, a century-old Pasteur laboratory reduced to rubble. On the bottom ticker, oil prices flash red, Brent crude hovering around $120. A waiter sets down a Turkish coffee and shakes his head. 5 weeks, he murmurs. 5 weeks of this, and nobody picks up the phone. He is not wrong. That question, who picks up the phone and who does not, may be the single most revealing question of our geopolitical moment. We are deep into the 6th week of the most consequential military confrontation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the two nations everyone expected to stand shoulder to shoulder with Tehran, China and Russia, have offered little more than diplomatic whispers and carefully worded press conferences. No military intervention, no emergency summits, no ultimatums, just silence. Strategic, calculated, and deeply revealing silence. Let us be precise about what has happened. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise attack on Iran, strikes that eliminated the supreme leader and several top military commanders, devastated military infrastructure, and triggered the largest energy supply disruption since the 1973 oil shock. Iran responded with hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles targeting Israel, American bases across the Gulf, and infrastructure in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow artery through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows, was effectively shut down. The world's economic nervous system went into cardiac arrest. And yet, Beijing issued a statement calling for restraint and dialogue. Moscow condemned the strikes as reckless and unprovoked. And then, nothing. No emergency BRICS session, no UN Security Council veto, no military deployments. The two pillars of the so-called multipolar world order watched as their strategic partner, their SCO and BRICS ally, their fellow traveler in the grand project of Eurasian integration, absorbed wave after wave of American and Israeli firepower. The question is not just why, the question is what this silence reveals about the true architecture of global power in the 21st century. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. To understand what is happening and what is not happening, you have to rewind the tape. Not to February 28, but to the entire geopolitical architecture that was supposed to make this moment impossible. For years, the narrative of the emerging multipolar world has been built on a simple premise: that the BRICS bloc, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the deepening strategic partnerships between Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran represented a genuine counterweight to American hegemony. Iran joined the SCO in 2023. It became a full BRICS member in 2024. China brokered the historic Saudi-Iran rapprochement in 2023 under its Global Security Initiative. Russia and Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement. Joint naval exercises, the Maritime Security Belt, became annual rituals. The message was clear. The days of American unilateralism were over. The East was rising. The West was declining. It was a beautiful narrative, poetic even, the kind of story that looks magnificent on paper, in conference halls, in carefully choreographed handshakes between leaders wearing matching suits. But narratives, as any journalist who has spent time in the bazaars of Tehran or the back alleys of Karachi will tell you, are not the same as commitments. And commitments are not the same as action. When the bombs started falling, the narrative evaporated like morning fog over the Caspian Sea. Consider the facts on the ground. 2 weeks into the war, BRICS had issued no joint statement on the conflict, not one. The reason is structural, not accidental. BRICS now includes both Iran and the United Arab Emirates, a country whose ports have been struck by Iranian drones, whose territory hosts American military assets, and whose strategic orientation has been aligned with Washington for decades. India, the current BRICS chair, spent its diplomatic energy not organizing a collective response, but negotiating safe passage for Indian shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia, another BRICS member, has been rerouting oil exports through the Red Sea port of Yanbu to bypass the very strait that Iran closed. You cannot build a coherent alliance when your members are on opposite sides of the same war. BRICS was designed as a forum for economic cooperation, not as a mutual defense pact. And the Iran war has exposed this distinction with surgical precision. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. Let us turn to Russia first, because Moscow's calculus is perhaps the most cynical and the most profitable of any actor in this drama. Before the Iran crisis erupted, Russia's energy revenues were in freefall. Oil export earnings had collapsed to $9.5 billion in February 2026, the lowest level since the invasion of Ukraine began. The Kremlin was preparing 10% cuts to all non-security spending. Putin's war economy was running on fumes, the fiscal walls were closing in, then came February 28th, and everything changed. According to the KSE Institute at the Kiev School of Economics, Russia is now earning approximately $760 million per day from oil exports per day. The institute modeled three scenarios. If the war ends by mid-April, Russia earns an additional $84 billion in windfall revenue. If it drags on until May, the windfall reaches $161 billion. If it lasts until September, Russia could pocket up to $250 billion, nearly 2.5 times the total Western aid package to Ukraine since 2022. Putin himself, at a Kremlin meeting, acknowledged the windfall and warned against squandering it. Carnegie analyst Sergei Vakulenko put it plainly. Before the Iran crisis, Putin was basically pawning the country to fund his war. Now he does not have to. So ask yourself, why would Moscow intervene to stop a conflict that is filling its treasury at a rate of $750 million a day? Why would it risk a direct confrontation with the United States to save a partner when that partner's agony is funding Russia's own war machine? The answer, of course, is that it would not. And it has not. This is not betrayal in the classical sense. This is strategic parasitism, the geopolitical equivalent of a remora attached to a shark feeding on the chaos without ever challenging the predator. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story, but Russia's silence is not the same as inaction. And this is where the picture becomes genuinely fascinating. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Russia has been providing Iran with satellite imagery, showing the locations and movements of American troops, ships, and aircraft. Moscow has also likely advised Tehran on drone tactics. It is no coincidence that Iran's strike patterns in this war closely resemble the Russian approach in Ukraine. Swarms of cheap drones hitting infrastructure, followed by precision strikes on radar and command and control systems. The tactical DNA is unmistakable. Russia sees this intelligence sharing as a direct tit-for-tat for Western support to Ukraine's targeting capabilities. The same capabilities that have contributed to the removal of thousands of Russian military personnel from the battlefield over the past 4 years. Washington knows this, and Washington has chosen not to publicly confront it. Why? Because the Trump administration has simultaneously delivered a windfall to Russia by temporarily waiving sanctions so that Russian oil can flow to buyers who can no longer access Gulf crude. The paradox is staggering. America is fighting a war against Iran, which is being helped by Russia with targeting data, while America is simultaneously easing sanctions on Russia to keep global oil prices from reaching levels that would trigger a domestic political crisis. This validates what analysts call Putin's logic of calibrated ambiguity, condemning the American strikes publicly while avoiding any direct criticism of President Trump personally, providing quiet operational support to Tehran while cashing checks from the very disruption that support helps sustain. It is a masterclass in strategic positioning. Moscow is simultaneously the victim's friend, the aggressor's energy supplier, and the chaos's primary financial beneficiary. If Machiavelli were alive, he would be taking notes. And then there is China. And China's calculus is an entirely different animal. The real breaking point starts right here. Beijing's response to the Iran war has been, by any measure, the most consequential non-response in modern geopolitical history. China is Iran's largest trading partner, its primary buyer of oil, and its most important source of high-tech goods. Chinese purchases of Iranian oil, denominated in yuan since April 2025, bypassing the SWIFT system entirely, represented roughly 13% of China's total crude imports by the end of 2025, approximately 1.4 million barrels per day. China championed Iran's membership in BRICS and the SCO. It brokered the Saudi-Iran deal that was supposed to usher in a new era of Gulf stability. Its Belt and Road Initiative runs directly through Iranian territory, connecting the Eurasian landmass in ways that would make Halford Mackinder himself reconsider his heartland thesis. And yet, when the strikes began, Beijing's foreign ministry spokesperson offered a single sentence: "We hope various parties will exercise restraint and resolve differences through dialogue." That was it. No emergency session, no military warnings, no recall of ambassadors, just 12 words of diplomatic boilerplate that could have been generated by an algorithm. Why? The answer lies 6 weeks in the future, in a conference room in Beijing, where Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are scheduled to meet on May 14th and 15 for the first American presidential visit to China in nearly a decade. This summit, delayed from its original March 31st date because of the Iran war, is the single most important diplomatic event on China's calendar. Beijing has spent months preparing for it. The agenda includes trade, Taiwan, technology, export controls, rare earth minerals, and the broader architecture of great power competition. For Xi Jinping, this meeting represents an opportunity to stabilize the most important bilateral relationship in the world, to box Trump into a framework of planability, as Brookings analysts have described it, that would constrain American unpredictability for the remainder of his term. China will not jeopardize this summit for Iran. Full stop. As Chatham House observed, Beijing's priority is to survive Trump's presidency without a major trade war or some other escalation. The Iran war, from Beijing's perspective, is Washington's problem. A strategic distraction that diverts American military resources and attention away from the Indo-Pacific, away from Taiwan, away from the semiconductor competition that Xi views as the defining contest of the century. Why would China intervene to end a conflict that is bleeding American attention and treasure in the Middle East? But the strategic calculus goes deeper. China's economy remains structurally dependent on export demand. Europe alone absorbs 15% of Chinese exports. A sustained energy shock that tips Europe and the United States into recession would collapse Chinese export orders, compound the ongoing property crisis, and expose the weakness of domestic demand. Standard modeling suggests China's GDP falls roughly 0.5% for every 25% rise in oil prices. The Strait of Hormuz closure is not just an Iranian problem, it is a Chinese problem. And Beijing's 2026 deficit target leaves no room for consumption-side stimulus. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. China, however, is not as vulnerable as it might appear. In the months before the war, Beijing quietly stockpiled crude at an extraordinary rate, boosting imports in the first 2 months of 2026 by 16%, and building its strategic reserve to approximately 1.3 to 1.4 billion barrels, equivalent to roughly 4 months of total imports. 20% of Chinese oil imports come from Russia, making it less dependent on Gulf supplies than most Asian economies. China has also undergone a dramatic acceleration of renewable energy deployment and vehicle electrification, a structural hedge against exactly the kind of fossil fuel disruption now unfolding. As the Financial Times noted, China is well positioned to turn the conflict into an advantage in the race for global economic supremacy. This is the long game. While Washington burns through military resources and political capital in the deserts of Iran, Beijing is securing its energy future, expanding its technological autonomy, and positioning itself as the indispensable economic partner for whatever regime emerges from the rubble. Because here is the cold truth that both Carnegie and Chatham House have identified. Even if the Iranian regime does not survive the bombardment, its successor will have no choice but to engage with China. Beijing holds a near monopoly on the delivery of high-tech goods to the region. It is the primary buyer of Iranian crude. The Belt and Road infrastructure remains in place. The economic gravitational pull is simply too strong to resist, regardless of which flag flies over Tehran. This is what strategic patience looks like. Not the romantic notion of solidarity between fellow travelers on the road to multipolarity, but the cold, unsentimental calculation of a civilization that measures time in centuries, not news cycles. China is not saving Iran because China does not need to save Iran. China needs Iran to survive in some form, and it is confident that it will, with or without Beijing's intervention. The ruins will still need to be rebuilt. The oil will still need a buyer, and China will be waiting, checkbook in hand. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. The UN Security Council vote on March 5th was perhaps the most revealing moment of the crisis. The United States introduced a resolution condemning Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf states, saying nothing about the American and Israeli strikes that preceded and provoked them. Nothing about the surprise attack launched during active nuclear negotiations. Nothing about the civilian toll. It was a one-sided document designed to provide legal cover for Washington's war. And what did China and Russia do? They abstained, not vetoed, abstained. They allowed the resolution to pass. The two nations whose veto power was supposed to be the ultimate guarantee against Western unilateralism simply stepped aside. The abstention was not an oversight. It was a message. The limits of solidarity had been reached. Compare this to what the same two nations did during the 2003 Iraq War, when France, Russia, and China together threatened to veto any resolution authorizing military action. Compare it to 2011 through 2014, when Russia and China vetoed resolutions on Syria multiple times. In the Iran crisis of 2026, the stakes are arguably higher, and yet the response has been weaker. The pattern tells a story that no number of summit photographs can override. The real breaking point starts right here. There is a deeper structural lesson in this silence concerning the very nature of the multipolar world, celebrated prematurely, it now seems, as the defining reality of our era. The multipolar narrative rested on an assumption that shared opposition to American hegemony would be sufficient glue to hold together a coalition of nations with vastly different interests. Iran, China, Russia, India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, South Africa, all bound by the simple fact that they were not the West. But opposition is not the same as alignment. India has been quietly negotiating bilateral shipping deals with Tehran while maintaining its defense partnership with Israel. The UAE is absorbing Iranian drone strikes while hosting American military assets. Saudi Arabia is rerouting oil to avoid the crisis Iran created. Brazil has been conspicuously silent. The BRICS framework was designed for the sunlit uplands of economic symmetry, for declarations about de-dollarization, for ambitious frameworks that look magnificent in PDF format. It was not designed for the fog of war. It has no collective security mechanism, no mutual defense clause, no rapid response protocol. When the bombs start falling, clubs discover that their members have very different ideas about who should be answering the phone. This does not mean multipolarity is dead, but it does mean that the version of multipolarity that was being sold, the version in which BRICS would serve as a counterweight to NATO, in which the SCO would provide genuine collective security, in which the petrodollar would be replaced by a basket of alternative currencies backed by the political will of a unified global South, was always more aspiration than architecture. The Iran war has not destroyed multipolarity. It has revealed what multipolarity actually is: a world of multiple power centers, each pursuing its own interests, forming temporary coalitions of convenience, and abandoning those coalitions the moment the costs exceed the benefits. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. The greatest irony of the entire crisis may be this: the nation that has benefited most from the war on Iran is not a combatant, not an ally, and not a neutral party. It is Russia, a country that has publicly condemned the strikes, privately provided intelligence to the target, and financially profited from the chaos at a rate that would make a Wall Street hedge fund blush. Moscow is simultaneously playing three roles in this drama: the sympathetic friend who sheds tears at the funeral, the quiet arms dealer who supplied the weapons, and the insurance company that profits from the fire. It is a performance worthy of a Dostoevsky novel, or perhaps a Gogol satire. China, meanwhile, is playing a different game entirely, a game that unfolds not in weeks or months, but in decades. Beijing is not interested in rescuing the current Iranian regime. It is interested in ensuring that whatever comes next remains within China's economic orbit. The Belt and Road will still need a corridor through Iranian territory. The yuan-denominated oil trade will still need a willing partner. The rare earth supply chains, the industrial corridors, the digital infrastructure, all of it will outlast the current crisis, just as the Silk Road outlasted the Mongol invasions, the Abbasid collapse, and the British Empire. If you want to understand what China is doing, do not read the foreign ministry press conferences. Read the 5-year plan. The 2026 to 2030 blueprint doubles down on import substitution, accelerates the transition to renewable energy, expands the digital yuan infrastructure, and prioritizes what Beijing calls strategic resource security. Every one of these priorities is directly relevant to a post-Iran war world. China is not reacting to the crisis. It is building for what comes after the crisis. And what comes after the crisis, if history is any guide, is a Middle East that needs rebuilding, an energy architecture that needs redesigning, and a global South that needs a partner who can deliver infrastructure rather than ideology. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. The American strategists who planned Operation Epic Fury may have calculated that removing Iran's leadership and degrading its military capacity would produce a swift capitulation, a Libya 2011 scenario, fast and decisive. 5 weeks in, that calculation appears to have been wrong. Iran has absorbed enormous punishment, but its retaliatory capacity remains significant. 2 American combat aircraft brought down in a single day, drone strikes on Gulf refineries and tech infrastructure, a blockade of the world's most critical energy choke point that has defied every attempt to reopen it. The IRGC's decision to target Oracle and Amazon data centers, striking corporate digital infrastructure for the first time in the history of warfare, signals a doctrinal shift that Western military planners had not anticipated. And the strategic fallout extends far beyond the battlefield. NATO is fracturing under the weight of the Iran crisis. Trump has called European allies cowards for refusing to join the war and threatened to withdraw from the alliance entirely. He has dangled the possibility of cutting off arms supplies to Ukraine unless Europeans help open the Strait of Hormuz. Macron's response was devastating. The United States can hardly complain afterward that they are not being supported in an operation they chose to undertake alone. Britain has refused to be drawn in. The transatlantic order, already strained by tariff wars and Greenland threats, is now approaching something that looks less like an alliance and more like a contested marriage in which both partners are consulting separate lawyers. This, from Beijing's perspective, is the real prize, not Iran's rescue, not Gulf stability, but the accelerating decomposition of the Western alliance structure, the system that has underwritten American global dominance since 1949. Every crack in NATO, every public spat between Washington and its allies widens the strategic space for China. The American-led order is not being replaced by a coherent multipolar alternative. It is simply eroding, fragmenting, scattering into a kaleidoscope of competing interests and abandoned commitments. The real breaking point starts right here. So where does this leave us? Where does this leave the great project of Eurasian integration, the dream of a world no longer dominated by a single superpower, the vision of Silk Roads, physical and digital, connecting civilizations from Shanghai to Sao Paulo? It leaves us in a place that is more honest than the one we occupied 6 weeks ago. The multipolar world is real, but it is not the solidarity-based, institution-driven alternative to Western hegemony that its enthusiasts imagined. It is a world of sovereign self-interest, of temporary alignments, of partnerships that endure precisely as long as they remain profitable. Russia will stand with Iran when it costs nothing and profit from Iran's suffering when it can. China will champion Iranian membership in every international forum and decline to spend a single UN defending it when the costs become real. India will chair BRICS while negotiating bilateral shipping deals with the country that closed the strait. The UAE will attend BRICS summits while hosting the fighter jets that are bombing a fellow member. This is not hypocrisy, or rather, it is not only hypocrisy, it is the fundamental grammar of international relations stripped of its decorative syntax. Nations do not have friends, they have interests. And the Iran war of 2026 has illustrated this axiom with a clarity that should give pause to anyone in Ankara, in Riyadh, in Jakarta, in Brasilia, who believe that membership in an alternative bloc would provide genuine protection against American military power. The cafe in Istanbul is closing now. The television is still showing footage from Tehran, a residential building with a sign on its wall that reads, "In Farsi, we stand till the end." The waiter is wiping down the counter. The coffee is cold. And the question that hangs in the air is not the one that the pundits are debating, whether the war will end in weeks or months, whether the strait will reopen, whether the regime will survive. The question is simpler and far more unsettling. If the two most powerful nations in the so-called multipolar world will not stand by their ally when it matters most, if BRICS cannot issue a press release, if the SCO cannot convene an emergency session, if the Security Council veto remains holstered while a member state absorbs 5 weeks of bombardment, then what exactly is the multipolar world? Is it an architecture, or is it merely a mood? Is it a system, or is it just a slogan? And here is the question that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. If China and Russia will not save Iran, their strategic partner, their energy supplier, their SCO and BRICS ally, the keystone of their Eurasian integration project, then who in this new world order will save anyone? The Silk Road is silent tonight, and the silence is the answer.